All right, guys, so welcome to chapter 6. So we're going to be moving on from scanning to enumeration. Now, this is where the investigation truly begins. Scanning told us where the machines were, okay? Enumeration is going to tell us what they are and who is using them. Now, we have four main objectives when it comes to this chapter. We're going to be talking about identification, the fingerprinting of the OS and the specific service versions themselves. Talk about the protocols. We'll dive into each different type of language, the SMP, SNMP, and LDAP. We'll talk about a little bit about web and cloud and how to map out website and cloud buckets. And then how do we automate by using the NSC to do some more of the heavy lifting. Now, what is enumeration? If port scanning helped us find the open door, enumeration is peeking through the window to see who lives there. Now, we've got a detailed blueprint. I don't want just to know that port 80 is open. I also want to know which software is running it, so I can look up specific exploits on that software. And the first way that we do this is we use what we call the SV, the version detection within the Nmap tool. Vulnerabilities are found in versions, not ports. So knowing that port 80 just tells us nothing about the risk itself, it just tells us there might be a web server there. But if we can do an SV scan on that port, knowing that it's Apache 2.4.49 tells us that it might be vulnerable to a traversal type of attack. So, of course, Nmap is not magic. It's all about the conversation. It's all about banner grabbing. It listens to the welcome message to determine, hey, does it actually have a certain welcome message? It uses different things like intelligent probes, because if the banner was hidden, it might send specific queries to trick the server into revealing itself. Or it might just be a database match based off the massive internal database of the nmap-service-probes database that they've got. The next one was about OS fingerprinting, the -O. Now, when we try to fingerprint the TCP/IP stack, different operating systems speak TCP/IP slightly different. For example, Windows usually sets a TTL to 128, while Linux will set their TTL to 64. So my analogy here for you is if it looks like a duck, quacks like a duck, it must be a duck. If it sends a packet like Windows, well, then it's a Windows operating system. So fingerprinting with a -O is just a best guess. Don't always trust it 100%. Just know, hey, it looked like Windows, so we're saying it's Windows. Now, we need to stop using generic scans and start speaking the specific language of the service itself. So we're going to cover some of the big ones: SMB, SNMP, SMTP, FTP, and LDAP. You got to know the language, otherwise we won't be able to understand each other. Now that first one there is going to be about the SMP, or otherwise known as NetBIOS. We're talking about ports 139 and ports 445. Now this is gold mines for a Windows environments. It leaks a whole bunch of information onto the network, such as host names, domain names, and even file shares. This is often the front door to an internal network. This is also the number one thing that is misconfigured in a Windows environment. Now, what's really cool about this is there is a classic tool built into Windows for this, and the command is mbt stat-A. This is going to grab the machine name table and start spitting out information to the screen for you and help you identify and enumerate what is actually running on this network. Now, there is a Swiss Army knife called Enum for Linux. Enum for Linux is a Swiss Army knife for a Linux extraction tool. Okay. Now, you're going to use this tool from Windows, but it helps you pull information for Linux. Now, a key feature here is going to be the RID cycling. It guesses user IDs, 500, 501, 502, 1000, to force the system to reveal, hey, are there any valid usernames that I can probably start looking for? Even if you don't know that they exist, it will start cycling through and let you know, oh yeah, I have a UID of 500, and give you this username for that UID. Now, you have to go look for credentials or find a different way to get in, but at least you know the username is a valid username. Another script that we like to use is going to be some of the in-map scripts. Now, these are some pretty specific ones that we like to use for SMB. SMB OS discovery will find the exact OS and domain name of a computer. The enum shares will actually list folders, and critically, it actually checks whether or not you have read or write access. This one's really cool because you'll start finding a lot of shares you didn't know existed, and then you'll find a whole bunch that you have read and write access to. The users will also try to list the user names. Now, it's going to attempt to. It's not always the most perfect thing. It depends on what operating system is running and how the machine itself is configured. For instance, a lot of Windows administrators are lazy, so they like to turn on WinRM, which is a remote management tool for Windows. If they turn that on, enum users can then dump every user that is on that PC to the screen just fine. But if it's off, then it's a little harder for them to try to figure it out. Now, SNMP, on the other hand, this is UDP port 161. We use this often in the IT realm to monitor our hardware. It stands for the Simple Network Management Protocol, and it's used to manage network devices, routers, printers, even servers. We use it quite often. Now, by default, it's insecure. It uses community strings, which act like passwords. And the number one community string out there is, well, public. Public is a read-only default, but it lets us know everything about the system if we just walk, SNMP walk, the public community string. Now, private, on the other hand, sometimes will give us read-write access. So if you can get into a router through the SNMP private community string, you have full root privileges to do whatever you want with that router. And so you have to be very careful. And I always like to say, hey, the tools here, SNMP walk and SNMP-check, these are the two tools to actually complete these type of enumeration. SMTP, port 25. Mail servers can tell us whether or not a username exists, and we use a lot of different commands, but one of the ones that we verify is VRFY. So if you send an email from one web server to another, the web servers then talk to each other and they say, hey, do you have this email address? Is John really a user? And then it will say, yes, I do have that address, or no, that address is not found. And we've all seen those emails come back where it's a bounce back. Basically, it failed to verify on the SMTP, and so it gets a bounce back. But the other things that we can do with it is we can use expand to see who is on the mailing list. So, for instance, if you know that a certain distribution list does exist, like support, then you could send an expand to that mail server called a for support, and it will tell you every user that is on that list. So that is one of the things that you have to be very careful for. Now they're going to use that list to help build valid usernames for password spraying later. That's normally what they use it for, or for phishing attacks. The next one is your traditional FTP, port 21. If you find FTP out there, number one thing to look for is check for anonymous access. And it's username anonymous, password anonymous. If you can read, we can steal data. If we can write, we can upload a whole bunch of information, including web shells, and maybe even take over the server itself. FTP is one of those tools that, if not used properly, can easily be broken into. FTP itself is also plain text, so that's why we normally don't use FTP. But in map-script, FTP anon will look for any FTP servers out there on your subnet and determine whether or not it can log in through anonymous access. The next tool is going to be LDAP. LDAP is on 389 or 636. LDAP is the phone book of Active Directory. Now, the thing here is the vulnerability that we can find here is anonymous binding. Now, a lot of system administrators will turn on anonymous binding just so people can search the directory even without authentication. But if this is allowed, you can dump the entire directory every employee, group, and description without a password. And the tool that we like to use for this is called LDAP Search. And so here's an example of how to use it. LDAP Search -X-H-B and the domain tree that you're looking for. So this is corp.local. Now we can look at some of the other protocols, such as NFS, which is 2049, or NTP, which is port 123. And so NFS is a network file system, and we're looking for something like the note root squash. Because if you see no root squash, what this will do is it will allow you to mount a share as root. So show mount -E, and if you can find a no root squash inside the NFS share, if you can mount it as root, that means you have full access to do anything you want inside of that NFS and bypass all permissions. Now, NTP, on the other hand, is all for network time protocols. NTP is easy as 1, 2, 3. Looking for the monlist command, it can actually leak the internal IP addresses of the last 600 clients that it has connected to it. So the monlist is one of those that by default it's turned on almost every NTP server. And if you can run that command, you can then see all 600 clients that connected to it and get kind of a lay of the land. You've now enumerated how many other hosts are out there, and these are all real hosts because they just connected into their NTP server. DNS zone transfers. This is an issue if this is turned on, because it's basically like saying, can I have a map of your entire network? And so if a zone transfer request is meant for syncing up backup servers, but if it's open to the public, it will let you dump the entire DNS record to your screen, and now you have a record of everything. The DNS servers, the mail servers, the Active Directory servers. You know everything that exists within that network. And to do this, it's a pretty easy command. You do a dig command, and then you try to ask for a transfer of a name server. So you got to do an @ and then what name server are you looking for? Okay. Let's get into something a little more fun. We've got web enumeration. We can look at the applications. Now, we need to find the pages they don't list on their homepage, right? And so we can do things like directory brute forcing, subdomain discovery, and virtual hosts. Now, the first one there was a directory brute forcing. Admins love to hide things on their websites, like /admin, /backup, or /config. But these aren't normally crawled. If you go look at their robot file, a lot of these things are forbidden to be crawled. So we can use a word list to request thousands of names and watch for a 200 OK response back from that subdomain. If we get a 200 OK, we know it exists. Now there's some other directory tools out there as well. So the last one was just brute forcing it. We went off a directory list and went for it. Now there are some other ones. So there's GoBuster. GoBuster is the industry standard. It's fast and it's actually written in Go. That's why it's called GoBuster. But it also can enumerate through a website and find different directories. We can use FeroxBuster. FeroxBuster is a recursive one. So this one's kind of cool. So even if you do find /admin, it will automatically start scanning for, well, is there /admin /users? What is under that directory? And then one of my classic tools that I really like is Durbuster. It's a very classic tool, but it has a GUI, which is nice. And it's really good for beginners. So you can download Durbuster even to your Windows machine, type in an IP address or a domain address up at the top, and then it will go see if it can find any of the subdirectories that might be hidden within that server. They're not really hidden, they're just not announced that they exist, right? Now, the next thing is going to be subdomain enumeration. So we were just talking about the directories themselves, like /admin. But what about dev.target or api.target? We're going to be looking at for subdomains. Now, there are two different methods to do this. You can either go passive, where you're using public records, like a mass or sublist3r. Okay, sublister. These are two tools that you can use, or you can just go active with it and just start brute forcing it. Again, with another tool just like GoBuster. GoBuster can do subdomains as well as directories. Now, virtual host discovery. Now, when you rent a website from, let's say, GoDaddy.com for $199 a month, you're not getting an entire server to yourself. You have to share that server. So what they do is they'll stick 3,000 different websites on one server. And so what the concept for virtual host discovery is there's one IP address, but there are many websites behind it. So sometimes dev.company.com points to the same IP address as www.company.com. The server only shows the dev site if you have the correct host header. And so what we can do is we can start fuzzing. In other words, we can start messing with the header itself. We'll fuzz the host header to find these internal sites that are really just hidden in plain sight. Okay. And so you might find something you didn't even know existed. And the nice thing about this kind of discovery as well is because not everyone knows it, doesn't means that sometimes the IT personnel who set it up doesn't even know there's a vulnerability there because it's just not publicly known. It's not really seen there. So GoBuster is a great one. FFUF is another good one. So these are a couple of tools. And if you haven't noticed just yet, we are now hitting to the meat of the Pentest. Pentest Plus has a ton of tools. When I took the Pentest Plus, I think it was over 400 tools that I had to know. I know it's way more than that now. And so just know that knowing the tools, knowing what the tool is and where you would use it, that's really where you're going to see a lot of the things for the pen test. It's like, oh, GoBuster, that's for directory enumeration and subdirectory enumeration. That's what I would use that tool for. Okay. Now the next category was cloud and API. So enumeration has changed. It's no longer just local. A lot of times we need to also enumerate cloud buckets and APIs. So there are tools like cloud-enum.py that will check AWS, Azure, and GCP all simultaneously and actually look for some of these buckets that might exist under a certain domain name. So the first one that I like to look for is storage buckets. I remember doing a capture the flag at DEF CON for this one. An analogy here for an S3 storage bucket, if you don't know what that is, think of it like an open filing cabinet. A developer names the buckets after the company. So maybe this is their backup bucket. So it might be company-backup. And then they're going to be looking for these names. Now, if they misconfigure this and they start throwing a whole bunch of data in their bucket of company backup, and for some reason we found a public entry point to it, we can steal their data or even host malware in their bucket if they let us give write privileges to it. Okay. Now, instance metadata, which is a server-side request forgery, is something very special. And I like to call this the magic IP. 169.254, 169.254. Now, 169.254 is called a PIPA. It's an automatic private IP address. But when you're dealing with the cloud, a PIPA is very, very dangerous. If you can trick a cloud server into reading the URL of 169.254, it will hand over its temporary credentials, all of its AWS keys. And this was a vulnerability. It's been patched, but it's only been patched with configuration. So if a server is misconfigured, it's pretty easy to still steal cloud credentials. Now, API discovery, this is how software talks to each other, right? We're going to be looking for Swagger or open API files. Think about the /swagger.json. This is normally where it's found. And it's normally an instruction manual on how to even talk to this API. Now, a lot of times they'll give us a Swagger file if we're doing a penetration test. But if we're an attacker or we are in a black box penetration test, they might not give it to us, but we might be able to find it without their help. So we do need to read the front side JavaScript files as well, because developers are really bad with API endpoints because they like to hard code like API version 1 / admin inside of them, telling us there's an admin portal that we can go touch, and they might even have the API keys within there. Remember, we're going to be looking at GitHub before when we were doing passive reconnaissance. Maybe we can get into their API keys without much work. Now, the next section is all about automation and scripting, because remember, enumeration is going to be very, 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 very repetitive. So we're going to use automation to work smarter, not harder. First one is going to be our nmap NSC. They use LUA language to run their scripts. And so, for instance, if we want to run a script, we can do a couple of different types of flags. The -sc runs a default safe script. We always want to run -sc just to make sure that we don't give it too much permissions on our own PC. We also can look at the -- script for the location. And then after you put the -- script, you'll put in what you're trying to run. So vuln is a vulnerability folder that's within the NSC, the nmap scripting engine, that allows you to run scripts that are already there. And they have a ton of vulnerability scripts that are there to say, like, hey, is this service vulnerable to any known vulnerability? If so, tell me which ones. And if we want to, we can also wildcard these. So you can see this one says SMB-*. This means run all SMP scripts on this endpoint. Now you can do custom automation as well. And so I think I told you in the previous slide that nmap is really good about Bash and Python. So, and what's really cool about this is we can then chain tools. So we can write a script that says, hey, if you see port 80, automatically run GoBuster on it. Okay, so this will help automatically chain automation to say, okay, there's a web server here. Here's the enumeration that I'm going to do on every web server I find. So I might as well have a script that automates my tests to see if I can break into it with GoBuster. Now the summary here is we identified a whole bunch of different flags, right? We did SV-O with nmap, knowing the fingerprinting and version scanning. We looked a little bit more at deep diving of a few tools, mostly protocol tools for SNMP, FTP, SNMP, sorry. We talked a little bit about web and cloud mapping. And then lastly, we now know that nmap NSC is good for automation, so we can use that. So this section here, I think we're done. Enumeration is done. So we'll have our blueprint. Next, we're going to start looking for holes in it. So we've got the versions. We know there might be some weaknesses here. We're going to start looking at vulnerability discovery to determine what weaknesses are in the software that we do find, and how do we find those weaknesses. I'll see you for that chapter.